We now come to the last three parts of the doctrine of method: the canon of pure reason, the architectonic of pure reason, and the history of pure reason. The history is very short, and the architectonic is quite short, and I won't have much to say about them. But the canon, although it's not that long, is nevertheless quite important, because in the canon of pure reason, Kant is going to present his, well, definitely not his final word, but insofar as the critique of pure reason is concerned, his overall vision of what the critique of pure reason has been up to, where it fits in our intellectual life, what we are to make of it, and its results. So this is not an unimportant section. On the other hand, it is a little bit awkward to talk about the canon of pure reason in a course on the critique of pure reason. And that is because what Kant is going to be doing here is he is going to relate his theoretical project to his practical project. He's going to talk about practical reason. He's going to tell us that actually the whole point of reason lies in the practical, it lies in the moral, and he is going to tell us how ideas like immortality and freedom and God relate to the moral aims of reason. Okay, why does that make it awkward to talk about the canon in a course on the critique of pure reason? Well, all of those topics are topics that Kant is going to return to at length in the books that he wrote after the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. So there is the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, and of course the critique of practical reason, as well as assorted later works. But those two books definitely are going to present to us a much, much fuller and more detailed vision of the kind of story that Kant is telling us here in the canon. And so one has a choice, right? Does one delve into the story that Kant tells here, even though that is really only a sort of first attempt at the story that will be worked out in much more detail in later books? Or does one take those later books and, apply them here and use them to illuminate what Kant is doing here? Well, Gardner, in his guidebook, takes the second option. He uses the groundwork and the critique of practical reason and even the critique of judgment and some of the later works to elucidate what goes on in this little chapter of the critique of pure reason. And that is great, and you should read it. But I'm not going to do that. Right? We didn't read the groundwork, we didn't read the critique of practical reason. This is the text we're talking about, and this is the text I am going to stay with. And that means that I'm not going to delve into all the details, but I do want to pick out some of the main points here and discuss them a little bit, right? So that we can see a little bit better how the theoretical project of the critique of pure reason is supposed to fit into, and in a sense even lead up to, and find its completion and fulfillment in the practical philosophy. So even though quite generally the critique of pure reason is thought to be Kant's greatest achievement, like his most major work, nevertheless Kant himself is indicating here that in the critique of pure reason we never even really reach the highest vocation of reason, because that lies only in the practical. So there is really something incomplete, necessarily incomplete, about the theoretical project if we haven't engaged in the practical project. That is what Kant is telling us here in the beginning. So for instance, he says, and this is at the bottom of A795, he says, nevertheless, there must somewhere be a source of positive cognitions that belong in the domain of pure reason, and that perhaps give occasion for errors only through misunderstanding, but that in fact constitute the goal of the strenuous effort of reason. So what we have seen in the dialectic is reason striving after the soul, the world, God, and never succeeding. But we have seen that Kant thinks again and again, this is maybe his most fundamental conviction, that our cognitive powers must be, like in a sense, they must be perfect, right? They must be teleologically oriented towards some goal that really is theirs, and that they are really, in some sense at least, able to get to. So there's something mysterious about the situation that we are in at the end of the dialectic. Why do we even have this reason if it seems to just lead us into error, and if the point of this theoretical philosophy is to stop us from being led into error? I mean, why? There's something missing. And so Kant says that it may hope for better luck on the only path that still remains to it, namely that of its practical use. So the practical use really is going to complete the theoretical use. It's going to show what was missing from, not so much wrong with, but missing from the theoretical use, and why it got into all the trouble that it did. It's going to explain that to us. Okay. So Kant goes on in the first section to tell us that, what we are really interested in reason is freedom, immortality, and the existence of God. And it turns out, of course, we've seen this in the dialectic, that all these three propositions remain transcendent for speculative reason. Again, speculative means pure and theoretical. And have no immanent use. That is, one that is permissible for objects of experience and therefore useful for us in some way, but are rather considered in themselves entirely idle, even though extremely difficult efforts of our reason. Entirely idle, even though extremely difficult. Again, why do we get into this trouble? Well, their importance, this is the beginning of A800, their importance must really concern only the practical. And so now Kant is going to tell us how freedom, immortality, and God are relevant, are important for the practical. Everything is practical that is possible through freedom. It is about freedom. Action, I mean, the whole difference really between action and events that are just happening in the world is that actions are free. And if they are free, then they can stand under a purely intelligible law. They can stand under a moral law. They can stand under a law that tells us what ought to happen, instead of a law like a law of nature, which tells us what does happen. So freedom and morality are two sides of the same coin. The ought only makes sense in the case that we have freedom. So that is what we're really all about, right? We are really all about our morality, about what we ought to be doing. Kant tells us that practical freedom can be proved through experience, and then we sort of have to assume this transcendental freedom that, of course, cannot be proved in any strict sense of the word. Okay. So, in the second section, on the ideal of the highest good as a determining ground of the ultimate end of pure reason, Kant is going to bring in immortality and God. Because at first sight it seems that, okay, maybe Kant can make this claim that freedom is important for the practical use of reason, right? That acting and being free are sort of two sides of the same coin, as I just said. But where do these other things come in? Right? What does God have to do with that? Kant definitely doesn't think about God as the one person who sort of lays down the moral law and thereby makes morality possible. Right? Essential to Kant's whole conception of human freedom and human morality really is that we are autonomous, that we make the law for ourselves. Right? It's a rational law that as rational beings we can lay down for ourselves. A law that comes from God, no, that's not the way that Kant is thinking about this. And immortality too. I mean, what does that have to do with freedom? What does that have to do with practical reason? So that is something that Kant is going to have to explain to us. Now here in this second section, on the ideal of the highest good as a determining ground of the ultimate end of pure reason, Kant asks his three famous questions. What can I know? What should I do? What may I hope? Right, now what can I know? That's what this entire book has been about. The practical reason is, of course, asking us, what should I do? And then theoretical and practical reason kind of come together in the question, what may I hope? Right, because I can hope something, well, it's going to be practical reason that gives me, in a sense, reasons to hope for something. But theoretical reason has to show me that I actually can hope for that, right? That it's not impossible. At least that we can't know that it's impossible. I can't hope for the impossible. I can't hope for that which I know to be impossible. Okay. So the new theme that comes into the story here is the idea of happiness. And Kant's basic claim is this. On the one hand, morality is not about happiness. Right? Kant is not a utilitarian, and he's definitely not some kind of egoist or hedonist. The world, like the moral law, like you shouldn't commit murder and you shouldn't lie and this and that, it has nothing to do with happiness. If somebody comes to you and says, I'm gonna torture you if you do not betray your best friend, you shouldn't betray your best friend, right? So happiness is really not the motivation here, shouldn't be your motivation. So Kant doesn't think that morality is based in happiness. Still, we, finite, sensuous creatures, want happiness, right? We strive for happiness, and it's completely proper that we are striving for happiness. So there seems to be a sort of instability here, a bifurcation, a little bit of a problem, even maybe a kind of antinomy, as Kant sometimes says, between, on the one hand, the moral law, which tells me what I ought to do, and on the other hand, happiness, which is also something that appears to have a claim on me. How do these two things come together? Well, that's one of the things that Kant is going to explain to us here. And so we have, and this is A808, the idea of a moral world thus has objective reality, not as if it pertained to an object of an intelligible intuition, but as pertaining to the sensible world. Okay, we have to think of a perfectly moral world as something that we in our actions want to constitute. What does it have to do with happiness? Well, here is what Kant says at the bottom of this page. Do that through which you will become worthy to be happy. Do that through which you will become worthy to be happy. So the point of morality is not to become happy. The point of morality is to become worthy of being happy, right? And Kant is going to go on to tell us that, like, the perfect world is the one where happiness is distributed in proportion to worthiness to be happy. Those who are worthy to be happy, those who are virtuous, are happy, and those who are not worthy to be happy are, I suppose, not happy. To be honest, I mean, I completely reject this conception of morality. I think it is, like, the very idea of somebody being worthy or not worthy to be happy is the worst idea you could possibly have. There's no, everybody, I mean, the best situation is the situation where everyone is happy, right? I mean, okay, that's maybe something for another time. I completely disagree with Kant here at this sort of pretty basic level of his practical philosophy. But okay, this is the way that he is going to bring morality and happiness together. So that's nice, but it still doesn't really solve the problem, according to Kant. Because, okay, if being moral is being worthy to be happy, but if at the same time it doesn't bring me happiness, then there are still these two different pools, right? On the one hand, something pulls me towards being moral and worthy of happiness, but on the other hand, something pulls me towards being happy, right? And although morality is, of course, for Kant more important, still, you know, the wish to be happy seems to have a proper pull on me. It's not something that we have to reject. It's not something that makes no sense for us human beings to feel. How do we bring those together? Well, Kant is going to tell us there's really only one way to bring that together. And that is through a belief in immortality and God. Right? And here God really not just as a necessary being or as the most real being or even as the creator of the world, although that all of that is part of it, but God also as good. Right? God as being wise and good. And so if we have that idea of God, if we believe in that idea of God, and theoretical philosophy has left that possibility open to us, if we believe in that idea of God and we believe that we are immortal souls, then and only then do we have reason to hope that at some point, namely in the future life, worthiness of being happy and happiness itself will coincide. Right? And so we may hope, we can't know, but we may hope that there will be a reward for being moral. And although that is not what motivates us for being moral, it is necessary for us to sort of, safeguard the unity and goal-directedness of reason. And so we have, in a sense, a perfectly good and maybe even overwhelmingly powerful practical reason for positing God and immortality that theoretical reason could never give us. What's more, this overwhelming practical interest in immortality and God and freedom explains why reason is always searching for those. And so it explains why in theoretical philosophy reason gets into all this trouble. Because it forgets or it doesn't understand that it's only from a practical point of view that we can get to God and immortality. And so it tries to get there in theoretical philosophy. It forgets about the moral. And then it gets into trouble. And so the Critique of Pure Reason has shown us how to avoid that trouble. And the Canon here and the moral philosophy of the later books shows us, what this real and positive reason for reason is to go after God and immortality as if it were the most important things it knew. Because it are the most important things it knows. And so here we have Kant saying at A813, thus without a God and a world that is now not visible to us but is hoped for, the majestic ideas of morality are, to be sure, objects of approbation and admiration, but not incentives for resolve and realization, because they would not fulfill the whole end that is natural for every rational being, and determined a priori and necessarily through the very same pure reason. Happiness alone is far from the complete good for our reason. Reason does not approve of it where it is not united with the worthiness to be happy, that is, with morally good conduct. Yet morality alone, and with it the mere worthiness to be happy, is also far from being the complete good. And so again, we have to bring them together, and that is what can be done in this idea, in this belief that we have in God and immortality. So in the pages that follow, Kant is going to insist that it is really morality that proves the existence of God. Well, proves, but it's a purely practical proof, but it's way better than the theoretical proofs that were dismissed back in the ideal of pure reason. So what we should also, I think, take from that, and I've already said this, but what we should take from that is that it's not from God that morality comes. Right? For Kant, we are moral beings. We have knowledge about our morality, or our being moral beings, about the moral law, and this is what points towards God. Not the other way around. It's not knowledge of God that shows us what the moral law is. Right? That's very important, I think. Very important for understanding Kant's ideal of autonomy. Even one could go as far maybe as to say that if we could know God and what God wanted, like if we knew, oh, God wants me to do this, like directly from an intuition of God, not from a sense of the moral law that we have sort of legislated for ourselves as rational beings, then in a sense we couldn't be free and we couldn't be moral beings. Right? It's precisely because we only determine our conduct through self-legislating the moral law that we are free and autonomous beings. So that's I think a very interesting take on the relation between God and morality. Kant might have a pretty nice answer to Plato's Euthyphro dilemma. So here's A819. So far as practical reason has the right to lead us, we will not hold actions to be obligatory because they are God's commands, but will rather regard them as divine commands because we are internally obligated to them. Right? That is the direction that Kant is thinking of. Okay, we still have a third section, which is on having an opinion, knowing and believing. And here Kant is going to set out a kind of terminology for thinking through different kinds of cognitive states that we have. What does it mean to just have an opinion about something, to believe something, to know something? Are there different grades of belief? Yes, there are, according to Kant. One thing that I think is especially interesting here, and this is at A821, is the social dimension that Kant brings to epistemology. So he says, persuasion cannot be distinguished from conviction subjectively, when the subject has taken something to be true merely as an appearance of his own mind, but the experiment that one makes on the understanding of others, to see if the grounds that are valid for us have the same effect on the reason of others, is a means, though only a subjective one, not for producing conviction, to be sure, but yet for revealing the merely private validity of the judgment. That is something in it that is mere persuasion. And so I think we tend to read Kant, and we have a lot of reason when we read the Critique of Pure Reason, we tend to read Kant as very much in the Cartesian, like I'm the subject and I'm going to think all of this through for myself mode. But there's a sense in which Kant seems to be saying, even though I don't think he sort of has struck exactly the same note in the rest of the book, but he seems to be saying that, he too will have to bring his philosophical ideas to others and see if he can persuade people in order to find out whether, maybe something merely subjective, maybe some mere persuasion has been mixed into his supposed insights. So there are pragmatic beliefs, and some of them are just there for theoretical reason, but some of them are sort of necessary for our entire moral outlook on the world. And this is what Kant says, what I call a moral belief. And so here we have at A828. I will inexorably believe in the existence of God and a future life, and I am sure that nothing can make these beliefs unstable, since my moral principles themselves, which I cannot renounce without becoming contemptible in my own eyes, would thereby be subverted. So I can't renounce God and immortality without becoming contemptible in my own eyes. Right, wow, that's something. It's still not sort of knowledge in some strong sense of the word, but there is a sense in which if I renounce God and immortality, I mean, if Kant is right about God and immortality, I'm not really convinced myself, but suppose that Kant is correct about God and immortality, you can't throw out God and immortality without practical reason sort of falling over. And if practical reason falls over, then theoretical reason falls over, in a sense, because the ultimate aim of what we do is practical. And so if we take away the practical, and I'm just, gonna give theory a leash to do whatever it likes, what rules is it gonna end up committing itself to? How is it gonna act? I mean, there's a sense in which everything falls down, according to Kant, if we reject God and immortality. So this conviction is not logical but moral certainty, and since it depends on subjective grounds, I must not even say it is morally certain that there is a God, but rather I am morally certain that there is a God. That is, the belief in a God and another world is so interwoven with my moral disposition that I am in as little danger of ever surrendering the former as I am worried that the latter can ever be torn away from me. It is sort of part of our self-conception, our most basic self-conception. So that is what Kant has to say, and then he ends the canon with a very nice note, where he says, look, some people might be disappointed that in the end, what we know about God and immortality and so on is just what, the most common understanding has always claimed, right? That I know about God and immortality because surely if I live a good life, I ought to be rewarded in the afterlife, right? That's the story. Well, that is not very philosophically profound. Okay, maybe the way that Kant has tied it up with everything else is philosophically profound, but the basic idea about God here is not very profound. And so Kant says the following at the last page of the canon. He says, do you demand then that a cognition that pertains to all human beings should surpass common understanding and be revealed to you only by philosophers? The very thing that you criticize is the best confirmation of the correctness of the assertions that have been made hitherto. That is, that it reveals what one could not have foreseen in the beginning, namely that in what concerns all human beings without exception, nature is not to be blamed for any partiality in the distribution of its gifts. And in regard to the essential ends of human nature, even the highest philosophy cannot advance further than the guidance that nature has also conferred on the most common understanding. Right, there's something democratic about this. Like, this is totally anti-Gnostic, say. Right, where Gnosticism is this belief that only those who rise to a very high level of knowledge are able to see, like, the moral truth about the world. You know, Kant says everybody can see the moral truth about the world. Right? Everyone. Like, you don't have to be a philosopher, you don't have to be smart. I mean, the person who cleans your street knows about the moral structure of the world. Everyone knows about the moral structure of the world, or could know about the moral structure of the world. Of course, right? How could it be the case that sort of the most basic aims of human life would be only accessible to a very tiny elite group of people? Right? This has to be accessible to everyone. And it is. And that doesn't mean that philosophy is useless. But, you know, we also shouldn't claim that philosophy has now finally allowed us to lead a morally good life. That was always possible. So, I think that's, like, especially for us, having, you know, spent so much time reading the Critique of Pure Reason, maybe thinking of ourselves as philosophers, this is a good reminder that, you know, the world maybe doesn't really need us as much as we might be tempted to think. Yeah, I'll let that sink in for a moment. Alright, brings us to the third and the fourth chapter, and as I said, I have very little to say about those. The Architectonic of Pure Reason is basically Kant giving a kind of overview of all the parts of philosophy and knowledge that there are. One thing that I really like about the Architectonic is in the beginning he has this story sort of about education, where he tells us that, you know, if you just learn philosophy by learning about the ideas of other people and reproducing the ideas of other people, you haven't really learned philosophy. So he says at A836, he says, this person has grasped and preserved well, that is, he has learned and is a plaster cast of a living human being. Right? I mean, somebody thinks, like some philosopher has come up with all these ideas, and if you just copy those ideas and reproduce them, then you are like a plaster cast of a human being. That's beautiful. And a little later on he tells us that philosophy cannot be learned. Rather, as far as reason is concerned, we can at best only learn to philosophize. Right? That's we've got to learn to think. That's what we can learn. You don't learn thoughts. I mean, you may learn thoughts, but if that's where you stop, then you haven't really learned anything that is worthwhile. You have just become a plaster cast. Kant also suggests, in sort of the sentence that comes after that, that philosophy is really the name for true philosophy, for all the true philosophical insights, which is sort of pointing forward to, I would say, some of the ideas of the absolute idealists who might make that kind of claim. And what is also maybe pointing forward a little bit to the absolute idealists, to people like Hegel, is this final chapter, the history of pure reason. It's very, very short, but it does give a bit of an impression of Kant saying, look, all these things had to happen in philosophy, all these problems had to sort of be worked out, these opposing things had to be put forward before criticism, right? This new and, in a sense, final stage of philosophy, at least of transcendental philosophy, was able to be put forward. So it gives a sort of goal-oriented history of philosophy, which of course is pretty reminiscent, but also the opposite of that. Like, it looks forward to what we're going to find in somebody like Hegel later on. Alright, that was the end of the doctrine of method.